President Biden's two visits. One he's been looking forward to, the other he sees no way around. Today, Biden arrived in Tel Aviv, his first visit to Israel since becoming U.S. president. It's a visit the White House says would have happened earlier had there been no pandemic standing in the way. Later this week, Biden will travel on to Saudi Arabia. It's a visit that would probably not be happening at all had there been no war in Ukraine, no inflation, and no skyrocketing fuel costs. On the campaign trail 2 years ago, Biden vowed to make Saudi Arabia a pariah, saying the Saudi crown prince's role in the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi revealed a kingdom lacking any redeeming values. President Biden's opinion, it may or may not have changed, but the realities of geopolitics certainly have. Biden now says he hopes to reorient, not rupture, the U.S.-Saudi relationship. In other words, he's hoping the Saudis agree to pump more oil onto the global market. It will be a delicate balancing act for the U.S. president, making his visit to Israel look more like a walk in the park. We have this report.
It's not the first time Joe Biden is visiting Israel, but it is the first since he became the president of the United States. He is meeting with Israeli leaders to strengthen ties that he says are already firm.
Because the connection between the Israeli people and the American people is bone deep. It's bone deep.
Among the leaders was Israel's defense minister, who briefed Biden on the Iron Dome. The Iron Dome is Israel's state-of-the-art defense system to intercept missiles. Biden stressed the two nations' close cooperation on defense projects.
We have reaffirmed the unshakable commitment of the United States to Israel's security, including partnering with Israel on the most cutting-edge defense systems in the world.
Biden then visited Yad Vashem, a memorial for victims of the Holocaust. He lit an eternal flame of remembrance and met survivors.
The visit by a president of the United States is always important because it helps to amplify the voices of the survivors. It helps to amplify the plight of the victims.
Biden's visit comes at a time of political turmoil in Israel and will take him next to the West Bank and then to a controversial stop in Saudi Arabia.
So what is Joe Biden hoping to achieve with this trip to Israel? I put that question to our correspondent, Rebecca Ritters, in Jerusalem.
Well, I don't think there's going to be any major strategic deals that come out of this trip. There are going to be no surprises, it is believed, from here, Brent. But it is, of course, very significant. It's always important when the US president comes to Israel. He's hoping to strengthen those already bone-deep ties, as he said himself. That's something that the special relationship between the US and Israel, something that the US are always very keen to, show their support for. But he's also trying to sort of shore up stability a little bit in the region, try and find some more peace and security in the region than perhaps in previous years, and try and maybe smooth the way, it seems, for a regional peace alliance that would counter threats from Iran. So in that sense, he's here to kind of negotiate between two sides who've been foes for many years, and try and arrange for some, regional alliance, as I say, a defense alliance between those two states.
And we know that his next stop is the Palestinian territories. Talk to me about how unusual it is for a U.S. president to go there.
Well, it's not unusual at all, Brent. In fact, it probably would have been more unusual had he chosen not to visit, not to meet with Mahmoud Abbas. Pretty much every US prime minister since Bill Clinton in 1994 first met with the Palestinian Authority has done so when they come to Israel, with a few exceptions, largely for diary issues or something else. So really, it is a pretty standard operating procedure. The visit on Friday is only half an hour, so the Palestinians quite disappointed noted that, the president is spending 2 days in Israel, just half an hour with the Palestinians. But of course, they're happy to greet the president, of course. And with that visit is coming a promise of more funding and opening up of more funding towards the Palestinians that were cut under the Trump administration. So, but definitely sort of an unweighted visit and something that is not going unnoticed by the Palestinians.
And it will, we could say, probably be one of the more easier parts of his trip. His final stop, we understand, is going to be Saudi Arabia, and that is going to be the most controversial part of the president's trip. Why is that?
Absolutely. It's, of course, very controversial, not least of all because of Saudi Arabia's human rights record, questionable human rights record, one could say. President Joe Biden himself called Saudi Arabia a pariah state, and also referencing the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman there, saying to do with their dealings with their alleged role in the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. So this is a 180 turnaround by the president, but it comes at a time when Russia has invaded Ukraine, and you're seeing oil prices rise across the globe. That's something that he's trying to take home domestically to lower the price at the bowser for people in the US, to try and make this trip more popular domestically, and of course ahead of the midterms come November.
That was our correspondent Rebecca Ritters there, reporting from Jerusalem. All right, I want to take this now to Trita Parsi. He's Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Trita is considered one of the leading voices on U.S. policy in the Middle East. Trita, it's good to see you again. I understand that earlier...
Thank you for having me.
Earlier today, you were part of a panel discussion entitled Biden's Trip to the Middle East, Bad Deal or Shrewd Diplomacy. So which is it?
Well, I was the moderator, and according to the panelists, it was clearly a bad deal, if there will be a deal at all. The most likely scenario, perhaps, may be that there won't be anything at all, in the sense that there will be a lot of empty rhetoric, a lot of photo ops, but in terms of actually signed agreements, particularly the thing that the Emiratis and the Saudis want, which is a written defense pact between them and the United States, in which the U.S. would commit itself to defend these dictatorships, it does not appear to be very, very likely. So the question is, will it only be these type of photo ops, or will there actually be some substance to the deal?
Yeah, because I was expecting Iran and defense policy to be the two elements that Biden would be able to address in both Israel and Saudi Arabia, maybe the glue holding this trip together.
Oh, it certainly is the glue from the perspective of the Saudis and the Israelis. This is not only a threat perception that they have, but it's also a threat perception that needs to remain in place if you want to see this warm-up of relations between the Saudis and the Israelis. But that in and of itself, however, creating a defense pact around that is not something that necessarily will stabilize the region, and it's also not something that necessarily will be helpful to the United States. In fact, what Tony Blinken himself wrote in the New York Times in 2017, when Donald Trump was pursuing this path and was seeking, together with the Saudis, to create essentially an anti-Iran coalition. He wrote in the New York Times that an anti-Shia coalition masquerading as a peace agreement or a defense pact is a bad idea, because it will intensify conflict in the region and potentially drag the United States in it. It would have been much better, he wrote, for the United States not to take sides, but instead pressure all of these different parties to cease some of their destabilizing activities. It's good advice in my view. It's advice I think Joe Biden should take.
And Trita, other than paying lip service to a possible two-state solution between Israelis and the Palestinians, this trip is not going to do anything to move the needle, is it?
It's a trip that is not even designed to move the needle. It's probably not even designed to provide much lip service either, because an expansion of the Abrams Accord, which is essentially that we set aside the Palestinian issue and move forward with normalization between Arab states and Israel, was explicit that this is not about resolving it, it's about moving beyond the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to have normalization in trade, even though the Israelis continue to occupy Palestinian territories and keep millions of Palestinians under occupation. So we should have no expectation that it will move the needle, because it does not even have that ambition.
And before I let you go, let me bring up Saudi Arabia one more time. From pariah now to partner. What does President Biden have to do here other than avoid a photo op with him shaking the hand of the Saudi crown prince?
Well, I'll be very frank. I don't think President Biden is going to get much out of the Saudis. I don't think there's going to be much oil production that will have an impact on oil prices. In fact, if oil prices is the driving force of this, then Biden would have been better off going back into the Iran nuclear deal and bringing Iranian oil to the market, because there's more spare capacity there and also a very large reserve of oil that is just sitting in Iran. So I'm not so sure that oil prices really is the driving force here. But my point being is that unless the Saudis feel that they either get something that truly rehabilitates MBS, meaning a handshake, or if they, or unless they get some security assurances, I'm not so sure that they will give anything to Biden.
Well, Trita, let me just ask you before we run out of time then, the Iran nuclear deal, if I'm hearing you correctly, I mean, chances for reviving that deal are about as good as zero right now.
Yes, and I think, frankly, further reduced as a result of this trip, because the idea that you can have a JCPOA, a Iran nuclear deal that stops nuclearization on Iran, essentially disarms or prevents the Iranians from having that armament, while at the same time building an anti-Iran military coalition, you might get the deal, but you will ensure that it will not last, because that's not what you need in order to make sure that peace agreements will be lasting and durable. This is the opposite of that. So it leaves me with the impression that the Biden administration has by now completely given up on even having that ambition.
Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Trita, as always, good talking with you. We appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Dr. Melanie Garson, she's an expert on conflict resolution at University College London. She joins me tonight from Tel Aviv. It's good to have you with us. The situation in the Middle East has dramatically shifted since Joe Biden visited the area last, which was 6 years ago. How has that changed U.S. policy?
I think it's time for the U.S. to revisit an understanding of how much the Middle East has shifted. So a recent survey the report of which is going to be released tomorrow by the Tony Blair Institute, actually shows a radical change across 5 countries, key countries in the Middle East, with sort of 72% support for Saudi Arabia's wide range reforms and reducing the power of religious authorities and liberalizing societies and economic diversification. And I think this is going to lead to a shift once President Biden begins to feel the ground truth in the Middle East, and how that will then realign U.S. policy a little bit.
Well, this should be music to the ears of the Biden administration, though, right? I mean, these sound like positive changes in public opinion that you're describing.
Absolutely, but interestingly enough, as the report details, says the parallel polling across Western nations actually shows a great misunderstanding, with the assumption that actually whereas only 46% of the West believe that the Middle East is friendly, the 72% of the Middle East see the West as partners. So yes, it should be music to ears, but I think there's a lot that has been going on, particularly in a very polarized US, that has distorted the reality on the ground and how fast the Middle East is moving into a place that is potentially a more positive ally for the United States.
And would you say that the nuclear threat posed by Iran, is that the main reason we are seeing a shift in security cooperation?
The Iranian threat, it has definitely been a galvanizing force, particularly between Israel and countries within the Gulf. I think there's also wider cooperation. I think it's not just the nuclear threat of Iran. I think it's the wider nature of how threats can operate in a highly connected system. So particularly thinking of how many of the countries across the Gulf are connected to the Internet of Things, that Iran is not only a nuclear threat, but an increasing cyber threat. And that threatens supply chains of food security, of health tech, and in that very wide conception of what security is today in the Middle East. Then we're going to see a real galvanizing of the partners, particularly in the relationship with Israel, with its tech advantages.
And, you know, you talk about these changes, and yet here we are with the Israelis and the Palestinians, the president visiting, and yet we know that the two-state solution is not a reality in the near future for either side, right?
The general consensus is that the ripeness and timing that would be required for both parties to sit down and really have a productive set of talks that can be both delivered at home to their home constituency, to their home people, is not quite there yet. Having said that, I think this is a particularly important step forward for President Biden to be here, to be able to. The process has been put on hold for a long time. There's a series of trust and confidence building measures by traditionally the Israeli governments haven't held much stock in the sort of the democratic narrative that's been coming out around the peace process. The Palestinians have felt equally put to the side in the wake of a lot of the advances in the Middle East. So I think as an initial step, this is an important building block to perhaps moving forward. And a belief is that President Biden will release news about an increased package of aid, that he will be visiting Palestinian hospital. And the first meeting with President Abbas is also a big step forward.
Yeah, and doing a lot of what the Trump administration did in its 4 years. Dr. Melanie Garson joining us tonight from Tel Aviv. Dr. Garson, we appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much.